So hello, friends. Welcome back to HeartScapes. Welcome to our monthly community class, A Sweet Taste of HeartScapes, where we are exploring the system of Reiki to be rooted, to be spacious, to be connected to each other, to ourselves, and to really remember ourselves. And in this space, in this monthly gathering, we get to do that by exploring different aspects, both of the system of Reiki and of our life, and finding the points of intersection between those things. It's my belief that our practice, whether it be Reiki or anything else, really needs to be able to be alive in our day-to-day life and our day-to-day choices and in our feelings and how we're interacting with other people in order for it to really be a benefit to us. So in this space, we explore different ways in which we can bring Reiki into our day-to-day life based on themes that come forward from the community, from questions that are asked, from things that are shared and things that are happening around us. So welcome. Really glad to have you here, whether you are here live or watching on the recording. My name is Michaela. I am the owner of HeartScapes Reiki here in Central California, Davis, California, and really enjoy walking this journey with all of you, both in this space and in other spaces. So let's get going with our class for today. So we're looking today at the topic of joy, at the presence of joy in our life, or sometimes the absence of joy in our life. And we're going to work through this topic, this, what seems like a very simple area of focus, a core human emotion of joy, and look at that through the lens and through some of the complexities of our life, through the system of Reiki, and through a really powerful resource in exploring the topic of joy, which is this book here, The Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. This book has been a really important resource in my life and in my practice for many years since it was first published. And the more that I work with it and the more that I work with the system of Reiki from the perspective of its Japanese origins, the more that I see the intertwining of the two and the ways in which they inform each other. So from time to time, I bring the Book of Joy into our Reiki discussions and practice, and it's always a very lovely and very wonderful place to be. A few cycles ago, I did a 21-day practice with the Book of Joy, where we really walked through each of the tenets in this book in quite a bit of detail. And we'll be offering something similar to that in a different format in the coming months. So I'll let you know a little bit about that a little bit later on. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. We always like to begin with a little bit of dropping in, a little bit of practice to gather ourselves here, to bring ourselves together, and to open up this topic, to really begin to examine our relationship with it. And so whether you are here live or watching on this recording, I'm just going to invite you to pause for a moment and just settle with me into a bit of practice. So taking a few breaths, just settling your body into a position that feels comfortable, that feels well supported. A position where you can feel your body being well held by the foundation of the structures below you and of the earth below that, so that your body can relax into this structure and feel easeful. Inviting the muscles of your belly to be soft, to be expansive, to make room for the breath as your inhale moves in and down, letting the belly expand softly. This brings our body and our breath into alignment, into connection for practice. These two essential aspects of how we experience the world through our physical body, through the movement of breath, of energy, of sound, of voice, all of these things together. And then we can bring the third aspect, the third mystery of how we interact with the world into connection with the breath and the body, and that is the mind. And so, on your next round of breath, I invite you to rest your attention on your inhale, focusing on the sensation of your breath moving in and down, allowing the breath to draw your attention back from everywhere you have spent it today to move down into your belly as your body gently expands with your inhale and gently contracts with your exhale. Just resting into this pattern for a few rounds of breath, with each inhale allowing your attention to focus a little bit more on the movement of your breath in and down into your body. And as you settle your attention into the center of your body, I invite you to rest your focus on the point just below your belly button, deep into the center of your body. This energy center known as the hara in Japanese, the first diamond, our grounded and rooted place connected to the earth. The center of our being and the home of our true self. And as you rest your attention here, I invite you to imagine that here in the center of your low belly, you find a spark of light. Bright, luminous, and clear, resting in the nourishing darkness of your center. Gently expanding as you breathe, so that with each breath, this spark of light in your center expands to fill you and surround you. A gentle pulse of light from your center outward with each breath. Just rest into this pattern for a few rounds of breath. And as you rest here, in the center of your body, the center of your energy, the spark of your true self shining brightly in all directions, I just invite you to take in this passage from the Book of Joy, shared from the Archbishop. Joy is much bigger than happiness. While happiness is often seen as being dependent on external circumstances, joy is not. It is what animates our lives and what ultimately leads to a life of satisfaction and meaning. Joy is much bigger than happiness. While happiness is often seen as being dependent on external circumstances, joy is not. It is what animates our lives and what ultimately leads to a life of satisfaction and meaning. Just invite you to notice how this lands for you today. What feelings or thoughts it brings up for you. Whether you feel in agreement with this statement And then taking 3 more breaths here together. And then coming back into this space together when you're ready. So for those of you on the call, I just invite you to either drop into the chat or come off mute. Just share what came up for you in that practice and with that quote. Just notice how it landed for you, if you felt in agreement or connected to that statement at all.
I thought it was nice. I thought like the happiness, it was interesting. Happiness is the external factors, and it sounded like joy is more of like what is present within your soul.
Yeah, it's I love how succinctly that particular quote captures this idea. And it was really that idea that you're naming, that joy is something that's more intrinsic in our soul. I love the way you put that. Um, and that happiness is more of this kind of fleeting emotion. It's what we often will experience as kind of coming through. We'll be happy because something good is happening, and then that thing will pass, and that happiness will fade, or something bad will happen, and we don't feel happy. That it's a emotion that helps us to notice what's happening in the life around us and perhaps inside of us, dependent on what is happening to us or happening around us. And that joy we can think of, and this was a new idea to me when I first started working with this book and with another teacher who kind of introduced this concept. But the idea that there is a certain deep, inherent presence of joy inside of each of us that is always there, that doesn't depend on what's happening to us, that is present even if we don't notice it because we haven't brought our attention to it or because we're so distracted by challenges that are happening around us. And this was a really fascinating idea and not one that I immediately could resonate with, because there are times in my life when I have felt absolutely incapable of happiness, right? The idea that in this moment, in this really difficult circumstance, or in this really difficult flood of negative emotions that I'm having, that there's something inside of me that's joyful at all times. And that I could, if I was in the practice and if I had tools and strategies and I had trained myself to do so, I could bring my attention to that joyful place and access a feeling of joy even in the midst of something awful, or just something mundane, or something distracting, or something challenging, or in the midst of a depression, which is something that I've experienced quite a bit. And so it was a really fascinating idea, one that was really compelling, one that I wasn't sure I believed at first. And the Book of Joy really lays this out in very accessible terms, and really, through the particular lens of Tibetan Buddhism, through the Dalai Lama, and Christianity, through the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, finding places of commonality between those traditions. And as I continued working with the system of Reiki, which has its roots in Japanese esoteric Buddhism, I could start to see these points of connection between these two systems, and the ways in which the Book of Joy gives us a roadmap to work with our Reiki practice, to bring practices from other traditions in a way that's explicitly focused on the experience of joy. And so I wanted to kind of tease out the connection between what I mean by the connection between Reiki and the concepts here a little bit, but I wanted to just pause because I think I heard you come off mute. So to see if you had anything else you wanted to share.
Yep, I like it. I think like the Buddhism, the book, and then just how it all kind of ties together. I'm really interested in it.
Yeah. So, from the perspective of Reiki from its Japanese origins, there's a couple of concepts that are important for this conversation. First is really related to the practice that we opened with, this idea that each of us has what we could call a true self or an essential nature, that there is a spark of life within each of us that is connected to all of life, that is resourced through all of life. It's almost like, we can imagine all of life being this beautiful complex web. We might call it the universe or light or spirit. Many ways of understanding that concept, and that each of us is a little piece of that larger web, a little spark, a little point on that interconnected web, where that larger life, that eternal life, is expressing itself as us for a period of time. That we get to have our sovereign life, our unique experiences, our perspectives, our thoughts, that are unique to us. And at the same time, we are still essentially totally connected with the web of life that came before us and will come after us. Inside of the system of Reiki, again, which draws from Japanese traditions, we find that sense of our true self in the center of our physical body, and at the place where our physical body, our energy, which is represented by our breath, and our mind, our focus, our attention, where we're paying attention, come together. And that place is in our belly, in our low belly. It's the physical center of our body. It's the energy center that feels connected to the earth, that is grounded and stable, where we feel that foundation of support. In the Japanese tradition, it's associated with the physical body, along with the physical earth, and it's associated with the energy of focusing our attention. It's the first of 3 energy centers that we work with extensively in the system of Reiki. It's the first diamond. It's the first point on this map, our first port of call. And in the practice that we opened with, the foundational practice within the system of Reiki, which is called Joshin Kokyoho, which translates as a method to focus the mind. We are focusing our mind, focusing our attention and our breath in this point, and we're imagining this spark of life. We're imagining that bright, clear, luminous spark that is our true self, that's undamaged, that is completely whole, that is not impacted by the distractions and hurts and pains and challenges of the world and of our day-to-day life, that remains intact and clear and pure and whole at all times. And that gets covered over by those distractions, by those challenges, by those pains of our day-to-day life, so that it's harder for us to notice that it's there. It becomes more and more challenging to feel that sense of our true and whole self. And so the system of Reiki gives us a set of practices that helps to uncover that bright light, that spark of life that is at our center. It gives us a system of interrelated practices that helps us more and more to live from the perspective of that true self. That's a bit of an overview of some of the foundational concepts that the system of Reiki is designed around. And then we look at what's being shared here in the Book of Joy that we began to see with that quote from the Archbishop. And I'm going to share one more here. Oh, that's not it. That's the one we just saw. We are professionals here. Let's have our proper technology. There we go. Ah, there we go. So in this piece, which is shared in the book by Thupta Jinpa, who is one of the main aides, the kind of co-teacher for the Dalai Lama, he shares that joy is our essential nature, something everyone can realize. We could say that our desire for happiness is, in a way, our attempt to rediscover our original state of mind. And so here we see reflections of what I just shared. This idea of our essential nature, of our original state of mind, that true self, that spark of life that is our pure and whole self, independent from all of the things that make us, distinct as a person, but also those things that make us challenged, that make us feel diseased, that make us feel unwell or unhappy. And in this case, that essential nature is being described as joy. That deep in the center of our self, there is this essential nature, which is joy. The image that's on this slide is a soul collage card that I made. That's another practice that I am in and facilitate, that allows us to make images, intuitive collages of aspects of ourself. And this one is called Joy. And I made this card before doing any of this work that we're talking about. And when I started digging into this book and I started learning more about the origins of Reiki, it was very poignant to see that what came through for me in this card was very much what is being discussed in this quote. This idea that deep inside, down in the bottom, in the watery depths of ourself, there is this spark of joy, and that it can be very challenging to reach it sometimes. That can be so deep and so deep down inside of ourselves that it can be difficult to touch, but that there's a way to find it. And in this card, I was imagining following streams of light down into that dark centered place and finding that spark of joy that lives there. In these practices in the Book of Joy, in the system of Reiki, we're given practices that essentially help us to do that, to follow the lead down into our joyful center. So there are many systems of thought and systems of practice that offer us a similar concept. The idea that there is a joyful or blissful, true center that each of us has. But many of us have experiences in our life where we just simply cannot reach that place. As I said in the beginning, when I first encountered this idea, I wasn't sure that I believed it, because there were times in my life where I couldn't imagine feeling a spark of joy in the midst of whatever it was I was experiencing. I had to experiment with it. I had to play with it. I had to test it out for myself over time to see if this was something that really felt true to me. And well, I wouldn't be teaching this class if I didn't come to the belief that it was in fact true. And the Book of Joy gives us a roadmap for how to get there. They lay out from the different traditions that the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop Desmond Tutu come from, a system of 8 obstacles that we experience in our life that are, obstacles that get in the way of accessing that true nature, that essential self, that joyful center. And 8 pillars of joy, the 8 things that we can cultivate in our life that do that process of clearing those obstacles out of the way, of moving distractions out of the way, moving things out of the way so that we can access that center of joy, even in the midst of something very challenging. And so I wanted to just briefly share those obstacles and those pillars. And to do that, we need the proper slide. Okay. So in this slide, we see the 8 obstacles to joy. And These are things many of us experience on regular bases, in small ways and in big ways. And each of them forms some form of distraction or intervention that gets in the way of us touching that center of joyfulness. And so they begin with fear and anxiety. This one is, of course, so common to our experience. Fear is one of the essential, the four primary emotions that we experience. It's believed by psychologists that we have four essential emotions. That's fear, anger, sadness, and joy. And three of those four we might describe as negative emotions. But I would prefer to kind of take out the value judgment of them being negative or positive, and just kind of look at the impact of working with these emotions in our life, because fear, anger, and sadness have really important functions that they play in our life. Fear calls our attention to something that probably we should be paying attention to. It directs our attention to what could be causing us danger, and that is a powerful and important function. The challenge is that we can get really bogged down in fear. Anxiety is a really powerful example of that. Anxiety being this just untethered state of mind where we get focused and hyper fixated on the thing that is causing us worry. And so it's easy to see the way in which fear can pull our attention away from joyfulness. And stress is being combined here with fear and anxiety, because often stress is a physiological response that we experience with fear. Then we have frustration and anger. Frustration being kind of a subcategory of anger. Frustration, irritation, things like that are kind of subcategories of anger. And again, anger is not inherently negative. Anger calls our attention to something important. It directs our focus to something that needs to be addressed in some way, either within ourselves or interpersonally, between ourselves and others, or ourselves and situations. So it gives us an important function in our life to help us focus our attention where we need to focus it. And similarly to fear, we can get hyper fixated on the experience of anger. It can become habitual. It can become that immediate response that we go to, even when the situation doesn't require it. We can become identified with it. I am an angry person, or I am a fearful person, as opposed to a person who experiences a wide range of emotions, including anger. So anger, frustration, all of the subcategories of that definitely calls our attention away from that center of joy. Similarly, sadness and grief, same story. Important emotion, sadness. Sadness develops a great deal of empathy inside of us. The chapter on sadness here in the book was so poignant to me, because firstly, sadness is where my default emotion tends to go. Many of us will have a kind of automatic place that we go when we're stressed, either to fear, to anger, or to sadness. You might know which one you are. I mean, of course, we can feel the range of them, but most of us have kind of a default automatic response to stress. And for me, it's sadness. For other people close to me in my life, it's more fear or it's more anger. For me, it's more sadness. And one of the things that is brought up in the book is that the experience of sadness actually builds our sense of empathy, our sense of generosity, and our desire to connect with other people. At least it does before it tips into the deep well of depression that can be very, very isolating. And so, it's one of those things to really pay attention to. A little bit of sadness can actually increase our sense of connection with others, but we can slip into this place of, a deep well of sadness that's difficult to get out of. And then they make a distinction between sadness and grief, make some really interesting commentary on the experience of grief, and again, the benefit of grief in our life. The fact that grief and love are so intimately connected that we can't really have one without the other. One of the things I love about this resource is that it is talking about these emotions that we oftentimes label as just negative, and it's talking about them with a great deal of compassion and a great deal of understanding about the function that they have in our life. From there, we go to despair. Some interesting distinctions between grief and despair. And despair is just really that profoundly difficult state of mind where we've given up hope, where we don't believe that there is anything that can be done to improve the situation that we're experiencing, whether that's an internal experience or a situation outside of ourselves. Despair being a really, really challenging one to work with. A less common experience than the others that we've named, but one that can be very, very challenging if we find ourselves there. On the other side of the slide, we have loneliness. Oh, such a poignant topic to look at. I actually am probably going to be doing a class, one of these community classes on loneliness, because it's such a poignant experience that so many of us have in a wide variety of ways. Some interesting distinctions between loneliness and being alone, that it's perfectly possible to be alone, not be around other people for a time, but not feel lonely, but feel perfectly content, perfectly fine being alone. And that loneliness is a state of the heart and a state of the mind that really brings our attention to a sense of lack, a sense of disconnection. The system of Reiki is focused profoundly on interconnection. The practices within the system of Reiki really focus our attention on connection, on our inherent connection with all of life, including each other, so that when we are physically alone, we don't have to feel the sensation of loneliness, that there's ways to treat that for ourselves and therefore bring ourselves closer to joy. We move into envy, jealousy, that experience again really connected to lack, the sensation of lack, the sensation of scarcity, the sensation that there is not enough of the resources that we need. And therefore, if somebody else has them, then that is a loss for us. And that feeling can get out of balance, right? Again, the noticing of scarcity, the noticing that we're lacking something that we need or that we very much want is not inherently bad. That helps to focus our attention on activities that will help to fill that void, to help fill that need. But envy and jealousy is a disordered, a diseased version of that, focusing our attention on meeting our needs. It's a very frustrating place to be, because when we're trapped in a sense of envy, we often don't actually see an avenue for getting our needs met. It's really a belief system that tells us that we're not going to get our needs met. There's no way to get our needs met. And therefore, we're going to spend our energy, projecting badness onto the people that we perceive as having the things that we wish we had. Very great deal of suffering that is involved with the experience of envy. Speaking of suffering, we move into suffering and adversity. And in this one, what they're referring to is, challenges that come to us from the outside world. So not the kind of suffering that's generated from, for example, hyperfixating on being envious or being angry or being afraid, but the kind of suffering that comes to us from the circumstances of our life. It's hard to imagine a person living through a life in a vulnerable body, in a challenging world with lots of complexity, and not at some point experiencing some form of adversity, some form of challenge and difficulty coming towards us from the outside world, and interpreting that as a point of suffering. And so how we meet and how we face and how we think about the adversity that comes into our life has everything to do with whether or not we're able to feel joyful. And finally, we look at the experience of illness and the fear of death that many of us, carry. It's so, again, poignant because it's so understandable that as a vulnerable mortal being in a body that can be damaged in endless ways, and that we will eventually lose, the fear of death can be a profound impediment to experiencing that inherent sense of joyfulness inside of us, particularly in a culture such as ours, modern Western culture, that doesn't make a lot of space for honest, connecting conversations about death and about grief. I've been hosting for about 2 years now a ongoing conversation with other Reiki practitioners about grief, about death, about our experiences with it, our roles as Reiki practitioners in it. And from the very beginning, our attention was focused on the inability that we seem to have generally as a culture to have honest, generative conversations about death. We avoid it. We are death avoidant. We are grief avoidant. Really just do not have good skills being passed on. Again, generally, of course, this is different from person to person, community to community, but generally speaking, we're not raised with good, honest skills and ability to have conversations about death, and to have a relationship with death that is positive. And it's very possible to have a relationship with death that is not experienced as inherently negative, but is seen as just as valuable as life. But we have a lot of impediments in our culture to doing that. And so illness, the fear of death, the fear of becoming ill, of the breakdown of our body is absolutely something that gets in the way of our joy. So I want to just pause there before we look at the 8 pillars of joy and just see if there was anything that stood out to you while I queue up our next slide.
I would say like the whole death aspect and like the like kind of how do I say it? Like accepting it, right? That we're all, we're all on this earth and then one day we're all gonna leave, and it's just kind of accepting it and knowing that and not being afraid of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's powerful. A state of mind where we're truly not afraid of that inevitability, and therefore we can be fully present in our life in this moment without jumping to the future. This is again part of what we look at in the system of Reiki, is how to stay, in the present moment and not dwell on the future, which often brings up fear, not dwell on the past, which can bring up anger, but really be present in this moment. And in this moment is where we find that spark of joy, for sure. And that list of those 8 obstacles, these are all very commonly experienced conditions of the human heart and mind and of our experience. And different people will have different levels of relationship or experience with them. So there may have been some things on that list that you're like, I haven't really experienced that, or that's not really a problem for me. That's not really fully present in my life. There might be others that you're like, yeah, that one there, that's the one that I struggle with. And so, when we look at this range of things, it's really valuable, and it's really part of the work here to just notice what our individual relationship is with each of those obstacles and each of the pillars of joy that we'll look at in a moment, because that really gives us a sense of where it would be most valuable to do our own work on these things. The Book of Joy gives you a series of practices that align with each of these 8 pillars and 8 obstacles. And the system of Reiki gives us very concise, very simple, accessible practices that address all of these as well. So let's take a look at the 8 pillars of joy. These are what are identified as the things that if we cultivate these things, if we focus our attention on these things, whoa, hello, that's not what we wanted. Come on, technology. You're making me look bad here, PowerPoint. I don't always understand how PowerPoint interfaces with Zoom sharing. So sometimes we get a little wonky. All right, stay right there. Okay, so if we want to be able to access that deep center of joyfulness, that the theory that's being presented to us here is that this deep center of joy exists in each and every one of us at all times, and that it is possible, even in the midst of great difficulty, of great suffering, of great adversity, it is still possible even then to touch that center of joy, feel joyfulness, and feel resourced and nourished by that resource that we have inside of ourselves at all times. The way that we do that is by working with practices that clear away those obstacles we just looked at and that bring forward, that cultivate these pillars. And I've divided these into aspects of the mind and aspects of the heart. And it's notable to me that these are presented in the order that we see here. And specifically, we're directed to work with these aspects of the mind first before moving into the aspects of the heart. This aligns very well with the perspectives in the system of Reiki, which tells us that our biggest job, the most important work that we can do is to learn how to focus our mind on what matters, that our mind is constantly pulled in so many different directions towards those obstacles of joy that we just looked at oftentimes. And that is why we're not able to experience our true self, because our mind is so scattered, our mind is so divided. And so that very first practice, that's the foundational practice in the system of Reiki, Joshin Kokyuho, a method to focus the mind. We begin with that practice all the time, no matter where we're going in our practice, what level of Reiki we're working with. We're going to begin with Joshin Kokyuho because it helps us to train the mind to come back into our center so that we can work on bringing forward the things that will bring us closer to joy and clearing away those that bring us away from joy. And so training the mind, focusing on aspects of the mind, is the essential first step before we move into the aspects of the heart. I mentioned earlier that the low belly, the hara, is our first diamond. It's the first place that we focus our attention. And that is because we're trying to ground our mind as that first point. The second diamond is the mind, is the head, is spaciousness. And the third is the heart. So we work on focusing the mind before we work with the heart. And we see that reflected in these 8 pillars of joy. So we begin with perspective. I love this. We begin with perspective because so often the place of distraction, the place of suffering that we're experiencing has to do with the perspective that we're taking on what is happening. That how we view the circumstances of our life and the perspective that we take on them is the beginning step to everything else that we experience. And so shifting our perspective on what's happening is an essential first step. And there's a lot of different ways to understand this, but a real important one and also simple one to think about is just the idea of shifting to a wider perspective, that the challenges that we have in our life are right up close to us. And we can so often get so focused on those challenges, on any of those obstacles to joy that we just looked at. So let's say we're in a state of despair. In a state of despair, that's all we can see. We're right up close to the circumstances that are causing that despair. We're right up close to the feelings of despair, and we're right up close to that sense of hopelessness that nothing really matters. We're right up close to all of it, as opposed to taking a wider perspective where we can see things beyond that sense of despair. We can see points of real beauty in our life and in the world around us. We can see the challenges other people are having and experience empathy for them. We can see places where we could take action, right? Maybe it's not so hopeless because we could do something to help. We can't see that when our perspective is right up close. And so taking a wider perspective is a simple, not always easy, but simple place to start in shifting the aspects of our mind that keep us in a place of suffering. When we take a wider perspective, that often brings forward a feeling of humility, a feeling of, okay, maybe I can take my attention off my own self for a while. I can see myself in perspective to other people. I can see that there's a whole lot going on in the world that doesn't actually have anything to do with me. I can, reduce the sense of my own importance in a certain way, which can be a funny thing to say if we're especially in a place of despair or a place of self-deprecation. We don't always feel like we think of ourselves as all of that important. But when our perspective is so narrow on our painful experiences, truly we're just centering our own self, making our own self the center of everything that's happening, even if we think badly of ourselves. And so getting that wider perspective gives us a sense of humility, shifts our perspective on our own self. Oftentimes, what can happen when we go through that experience of shifting perspective, bringing in greater humility, is that we develop a greater sense of humor, particularly about ourselves. We're able to laugh at ourselves. We're able to laugh with other people. We're able to, kind of see the absurdities and the ridiculousnesses in some of the challenges that we're having. Sometimes when we take a step back from what we're experiencing, just look at it from some distance, look at it through the eyes of other people, we can see that sometimes it's just a little bit ridiculous. And we can laugh at ourselves. We can laugh at our challenges a little bit. We can laugh at our habits, our foibles, those silly things that we do that feel so important to us in the moment, but are really just habits that we've developed over time. We want to be careful not to be emphasizing this isn't talking about a unkind form of humor. This is really the state of mind where we can look at ourselves and just kind of take ourselves less seriously, take the situation a little bit less seriously, and find humor and laughter even in a difficult situation. Even the concept of gallows humor, right? Where we can sometimes make jokes and make humor about really dark things to just help us stay present in the midst of it, falls into this category. And from there, we are able to cultivate a greater sense of acceptance for what is happening in our life. From that place of acceptance, we can begin working through the aspects of the heart. And that interestingly begins with forgiveness. Now, forgiveness is a whole masterclass in and of itself. Before he wrote the Book of Joy with the Dalai Lama, Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote the Book of Forgiveness with his daughter. And it's an absolutely profound piece of writing, piece of perspective, but also practical guide. It is not just concepts and perspectives about forgiveness, but it is a practical workbook on how to work through forgiveness. And one of the things that's really central to that is the notion that forgiveness is a state of our own heart, even more than it is a state of interpersonal relationship between us and another person. That forgiveness is truly an orientation of the heart. It is how we are in relationship to the experiences that have harmed us. And that can be with ourself, beginning with self-forgiveness, and it can be between us and other people. It really acknowledges that being trapped in a state of unforgiveness is an attachment, that when we are in a state of unforgiveness, we are attached to the suffering that we've experienced. We are attached to the wrongs that have been done to us. We're attached to the wrongs that we have done that we cannot forgive ourselves for. And that state of attachment not only keeps us locked in suffering, but it also keeps us from moving into greater sense of joyfulness. And it often impacts the behaviors that we have towards others, because we're stuck in this sense of suffering. And so forgiveness is our first state of the heart. It's all about our heart's relationship to the world and to ourselves. Forgiveness can happen between us and a person who's done wrong to us without that other person being involved at all. It can be entirely an internal experience, and it is an experience of freedom. And from that freedom, from that sense of forgiveness, we move into gratitude. Gratitude being that most powerful experience of being fully present in the moment. Because when we truly look at this present moment, and we can be rooted in this moment as opposed to the past, what has happened in the past, what has happened, what will happen in the future, is when we can cultivate a sensation of gratitude. We're grateful for what is present in this moment right now, not what happened in the past, not what will happen in the future. Gratitude is such a powerful state of heart and has such an important impact on our physiology. Gratitude is one of the most highly studied emotions that we have. There's a tremendous amount of research about gratitude, the impact of cultivating gratitude, the impact on our body, on our state of mind, our physiology, our relationships. There's a powerful cascade of hormonal activity that happens when we experience gratitude that shifts us into a state of connection, a state of openness, open-mindedness, a state of generosity for others and towards others. That happens when we experience real gratitude. And this is why there's so much gratitude practices that are shared. There's quite a bit available about the benefits of practicing gratitude, and endless amounts of ways that we can actively practice gratitude. Again, there's a whole other class that I teach that's specifically focused on gratitude. It's a powerful, powerful tool for us. From gratitude, we move into compassion, that state of being able to be with ourselves and others. Compassion, from the words compassion, which means to be with the pain and intense experiences of others and of ourself. The precepts of the system of Reiki are really built on a foundation of compassion. Just for today, I'm compassionate to myself and to all others, is where we begin. And compassion for self sometimes being the more challenging of those two, and really the place we need to start. Truly being able to be with our own self, to be with others in whatever they're experiencing without trying to fix it, to solve it, to change it, to make them do anything, but simply to be with them is a powerful aspect of the heart, and one that inspires us to generosity, which is our eighth pillar of joy, the fourth aspect of the heart, the experience of generosity, of spending our time, our energy, our resources in service to others. And truly, this is where the thesis of this book really brings us, that the most consistent, reliable way of accessing that deep well of joy that's inside of ourselves is through the practice of generosity, because generosity is the culmination of all of these things that come before. We can't be truly generous if we haven't taken a wider perspective, if we haven't stepped back from our own life to get a wider perspective, if we haven't generated humility, that our story is not the most important, right? That others' stories are just as important, if not more. Bringing a little bit of humor and lightness into that experience, which is so connecting between people. Coming to a state of acceptance with what is, forgiveness for what has occurred, gratitude for the moment that we are experiencing, compassion for ourselves and others, and then taking action in service of all of that, in service of others, is the act of generosity. And that by engaging in generosity as a practice consistently, that this is the most reliable way to access that deep well of joy that is our center, that is our birthright, that is who and what we are. At least that is what's being proposed through this work. And this work, of course, is built on the foundation of centuries and centuries and centuries of practice, of observation of the human experience, and looking at the commonalities between the conclusions that have been founded in various traditions that all center so strongly on the experience of love and compassion. And that brings us to the end of our time for today. I'm glad that we were able to get through all of those obstacles and pillars, each of them, again, having their own set of practices that we can work with. Each of them a whole world in and of themselves, but intimately connected to each other and in our lives. I hope you can see, and probably have had reflections in your own life of the ways in which these things connect with each other. If you are interested in following more of this work, I will be offering a class on the Book of Joy where we dive into these practices in May. And in the email that I send out following this class, there'll be information about that. And as we move from this place, I just really hope that something in this was valuable for you, that there's something that you can take into your life. And I would invite you, challenge you to choose one thing that you can do today that cultivates one of these pillars of joy. Is there an act of generosity you can take? Is there a moment of compassion you can have for yourself? Can you do a gratitude practice? Can you have a moment of stepping back, taking some perspective, and maybe laughing at your conditions a little bit? So I just really invite you to do that, to take some time to engage in these pathways to joy in some way. And let me know how it goes. Let me know what you notice. Let me know what questions come up and where you would like to see this work going in the future. If you have a request or a suggestion for a future topic for this monthly class, I welcome them. It's really a collaborative effort. The topics come often from the community, and so I welcome your input. Thank you so much for joining me today. The recording will be available in the next day or so, and I really appreciate you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.